Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and you all look great. I love this facility, and I've worn my lawyer's costume this morning, and so I won't be too intimidating. I'm wearing my seeker-sensitive cartoon tie for you. I'm going to talk this morning. I'm going to try to be more educational than inspirational. I want to hopefully have something that will be of practical use for you, for your church. I want to talk about two challenges that churches face. And I can't see the screen, but there should be a gentleman, a African-American gentleman preaching very, very enthusiastically. This gentleman, his name is Winford Williams, and he is in the city of Richmond, California, which is in the greater San Francisco area. Reverend Williams is pastoring a small church there, and in 2020 there was a complete lockdown of society, but he decided he would not break 2,000 years of Christian tradition, and he would hold services on Easter morning. So that's what he did. And so while he was actually delivering his sermon, a deputy, sheriff's deputy came to the back of the church, motioned for him to come back there. He politely declined, said, "I'm going to finish my Easter sermon, and then I'll see you." Anyway, he was criminally cited for holding a church there. Next slide. There's a great quote by C.S. Lewis that I wanted to give you. I don't know. I can't even see it. If you could read it, it talks about tyranny. And the idea is that there are those who oppress us, and they oppress us because they think they're doing it for the greater good of society. He argues that is the worst form of oppression, because they're doing that because their conscience tells them that it's good. And these are these moral busybodies out there trying to take away our rights regarding our constitutional rights, our religious liberties. A lot of pastors, when the pandemic started, they wanted to be obedient to the government. They wanted to go along, and they were scared. I was scared. I was, at home washing my hands alone 40 times a day. I wouldn't touch my face. I don't know if you remember all of that. And then I was watching the news, and there was these folks in China in hazmat suits spraying disinfectant fog on the streets, the sidewalks, and it was scary. So we just thought, well, this is the plague, and we need to follow up on it. Well, if I can see the next slide, there was a problem. At first, I thought when they closed down the churches, this is not an attack on churches. This is simply neutral laws. They're not stopping public assemblies because of what we say, but they're doing it because of general public health. Well, in Sacramento, as desks in classrooms sat empty, as plywood went up on the windows of businesses that were deemed non-essential, as churches stood vacant, there were some people who wanted to protest this. And so they were going to go to the California State Capitol. And there, the way things work is you go to the California Highway Patrol. They handle security on the Capitol grounds. And so they asked for a permit to have a protest there. And the California Highway Patrol said, "We're not going to give you a permit. There's a public health order, and we don't allow assemblies of any kind whatsoever. It doesn't matter what you say." So instead of breaking out store windows downtown and that sort of thing, they decided to go to the federal court and file a lawsuit, try to get an injunction. Injunction means to stop the train, essentially, legally, keep something from going forward. And so they did. And the governor of California defended against the lawsuit, saying, this is just a neutral law of general applicability. It doesn't matter what you say, what the reason why you're while you're protesting, we prevent all assemblies of all kinds. And so the judge, on that basis and on that representation, denied the injunction. Well, just a couple of weeks later, I smartened up. A gentleman died underneath the knee of a police officer in the state of Minnesota, and protests sprang up across the country, but in California from the Mexican border to Oregon. And the governor of California said, and I quote, "We see your rage. Your rage is real. Keep doing this. Keep protesting. God bless you." And it was at that moment I knew that progressive protests were welcome. Church assemblies were prohibited. And so we, at that point, knew that we had to do something to try to open up churches. And we filed lawsuits all across the West, and lawsuits were filed across the country, and we were losing again and again and again. And it was very difficult to try to explain to pastors. They'd say, "Isn't the Constitution clear?" And the courts were telling us, well, there is a pandemic exception to the Constitution. Well, in the county of Santa Clara, it was the most restrictive place in the nation, more so than New York City. And the county board of supervisors put in concentrated power, complete absolute power in the public health official. And the public health official would deputize all of her employees, and based on anonymous tips, would go to businesses, churches, and they would fine them. They would enter without a warrant. They would, when they questioned people, even though there may be fines involved, there was no what they call Miranda warnings. You know Miranda, did you ever watch, are any of you old enough to remember 1 Adam 12? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or do can be used against you in a court of law. So if you're smart and you're the subject of a criminal action, and the police officer asks you questions, or the detective, you say, "I'm sorry, I won't be able to accommodate you on this. You'll have to speak with my attorney." Most people who've taken a high school civics class know that much. But they would question without Miranda warnings. They would fine churches $5,000 a day. Do you remember the old gas pumps that would ding every time you got a gallon? So that's how things were happening. And so in churches, churches were being fined $5,000 a day, even on days they were closed. I remember one of the well-known pastors decided he was going to hold church anyway in that area. And when I met with him and some other attorneys, he was already up to about $94,000, $95,000. It went up higher into the six figures. There was one church that got into 7 figures of fines. They were just getting fined $5,000 a day. And so if you wanted to appeal this, you had to pay the fine first. So you serve your time first, and then you get to appeal it. And guess who you appeal it to? You appeal it to the county that fined you. And so the government was the police, they were the prosecutor, and they were the judge. And so there were 5 churches in that county that they just had enough. That was a bad summer. They were forced outside, and there was a lot of smoke, and it was very hot. And as their churches sat vacant, they asked if I was invited in to see if I could help them. And the odds were bad. We were losing every time. And something happened. Sometime I believe it was October of that year, was one of the justices of the Supreme Court passed away, and very quickly another one took her place, because we were losing. We'd lost, I think, 2 or 3 times in the Supreme Court. It said that the road to victory in the Supreme Court is paved by losses. pretty important thought for a life, I suppose. But anyway, these pastors of 5 churches asked, what is the litigation going to look like? And I said, we're going to file a motion for a temporary restraining order and an injunction. And I said the district court, the trial court, is going to deny that. And said, then we're going to file an emergency motion in the Ninth Circuit. And they said, oh my goodness, the Ninth Circuit, they've got quite the reputation of not being church-friendly. So what are our odds there? I said, well, it's not good. And they said, what's next? The Supreme Court. And I said, yeah, that's the last stop on the train for this. And they wanted to know, what are our odds in the Supreme Court? And I said, they're 1%. And that's not hyperbole. I'm not a drama queen. That's the batting average to get a case to the Supreme Court. But with their churches sitting empty month after month, they decided they were going to pull the trigger on this and said, go forward. And it happened just like I said. We lost in the trial court, lost in the Ninth Circuit, filed an emergency writ in the Supreme Court. And they were optimistic and were praying. And I thought, they certainly are men of God, have a lot more faith than I do on this. But anyway, on a Friday night, I got an email from the court. We got a 6-3 ruling in favor of the churches, and that Sunday they were able to open up, and that was the last county in the country which churches could begin to gather. So thank God for that. So I'm very optimistic that we have a good set of justices on the Supreme Court. We still have difficulties getting up there, but I want to encourage you that I think that there was something providential happening in getting the people there in place. I think the word perhaps providential is overused, but in this case, I'm very much convinced of that, and it's helping the kingdom of God, helping our work. So our first challenge that churches face is against the government. However, I would like to tell you that even though the churches, we got past this pandemic issue, I foresee that in the future we will have something else happening. I believe, quite likely, the government will use something like another plague, a war, a famine, and they're going to want to close the churches down again. So my question to you is, did you learn anything from last time? I've told churches that if pastors call me saying they're closing down the churches, what do we do? I said, well, didn't you learn anything last time? Maybe you shouldn't be calling a lawyer, you should be calling a psychiatrist. You can't be naive. They're going to close you down, and you just have to resist that. And one of the things we did during that time was we signed, I don't know how many attorney's fees agreements for $1 for churches. Said that if you're prosecuted for staying open, we're going to represent you in the criminal defense for free. And every pastor I talked to thought it would be the greatest honor of their life to be put in jail for having church. And I think that's what we have to have. We have to have that courage and stay the course with it. William Pitt. Anyone know who William Pitt is? Not the pitcher. He was a prime minister in England in the 19th century, late 18th century. He said this: necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. So that is something we need to watch out for, is the government telling us that there's some great necessity, that your constitutional rights don't matter right now. Next item, challenge to the church, is cultural. And I don't see what slide we've got in there. Yes, cultural. So let's see the next slide as well. And specifically, the biggest challenge we are finding is with the LGBTQ advancement. There are we're seeing lots of legal challenges to that. And I want to address that. This is a difficult issue, but we're all adults, and we're going to put on our big boy pants and just plow through this. If I can see the next slide. There is a lot of concern about federal and state legislation, anti-discrimination laws, and what they call civil rights laws that promote LGBTQ rights, and by doing that, they don't keep them equal with the rights of religious liberties. One is higher than the other, has greater impact than the other. Now, a lot of people are looking at, again, state and national laws. But what you really need to be looking at are local ordinances, local laws, what your county and municipality is doing. Let me give you an example of this case. I represented 5 churches and a Christian radio station in De Pere, Wisconsin. Anyone know where De Pere is? You probably know where Green Bay is. That's the next town over. And so this town passed an ordinance. And let me go through those with you. If I can see the next slide. They dealt with 3 things, and one is public accommodation, the other is employment, and the other is speech. Let's take a. I want to go through these, and you tell me what you think is wrong with them. If I can have the next slide. I think is that a slide that talks about discrimination? Okay, take a look at that. Read that. What do you think? Do you see anything wrong with there? You think that would impact churches? Any advertisement, any conduct that treats someone differently? Well, that's pretty broad when you think about it. Let's look at the next slide. And this is public accommodation. You know what a public accommodation is? Is this a place of public accommodation? How many think it is? Okay, it's not. But this is what a public accommodation is. They said they defined it in this town very broadly to include essentially anything that had some sort of goods or services passed through, even if it was nonprofit, and it included nonprofit. And we said that's going to sweep in churches if you look at it literally. So when we sued them, when the churches wanted to sue them to try to overturn this ordinance, we did something called discovery. If you've had the misfortune of being involved in a lawsuit, they have something called discovery where you get the evidence from the other side. So in this discovery process, we asked the city, does public accommodation include churches? And they said, yes, it does. And so we looked at that, and we searched all of the case law throughout the country, and including Puerto Rico, and found that this ordinance was going to make churches, it would be the only place in the country in which churches were deemed a place of public accommodation. Why does that matter? Well, if you're a place of public accommodation, just like Taco Bell, then you can't decline service to people. You have to abide by any number of secular laws, and churches have do their own thing. They have their own gig going, and we don't follow all of those laws because we have constitutional protections. And so this was going to be a very radical move by them. So they were going to make churches places of public accommodation. Come to find out, these churches, not surprisingly, they had weddings and funerals. They would give, and some of the churches charged that, a user fee or something of that nature. They also would provide food. They had a food pantry for the homeless or people who were down on their luck. They would provide. One church was across the street from a public school, and when parents would wait for their kids to come home and line up, they would allow the parents to use the church's parking lot, and they would provide a snack once a month to the children that sort of thing. So they all fell under this item of public accommodation. Let's see the next slide. I'm sorry, I can't see it from here. Employment. And go ahead and run through that, all those items in that slide. So with employment, you couldn't discriminate based on not only on a number of things that were problematic for the churches. I can't see it. Oh, there it is up there. All right. So for churches, come to find out, well, churches discriminate on a number of things. For example, in employment, we found that Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, most Baptist churches, they don't hire women to stand in the pulpit to be the lead pastor. We found that so they discriminate based on sex. We found out that they usually have sexual ethics that they required their employees, all of their employees, to follow. And the churches couldn't do that. And this happens, in fact. And churches and Christian schools are frequently sued for dismissing someone. I get calls, the receptionist is living with her boyfriend without the benefit of marriage, and they're going to have to let them go and that sort of thing. And churches get sued for that. They do discriminate. They have certain rules. Now, it doesn't mean they don't try to find most churches I have found will try to bring some sort of redemptive help in that. They'll tell them they need to get married or separate and have a sense of repentance, and they could continue on. Nonetheless, under this law, the churches would have problems. And then the next thing, if I could look at the next slide, and I can't read that is, speech. This was really interesting. You said, if you look at this, do you see any problems with this? We found that every one of our churches, and of course the radio station, would have websites, and the radio station would broadcast things, of course. So they're all about speech, freedom of the press, that sort of thing. But with the churches, they all have websites. All of them would have the pastor's sermons. Back then, they would be archived, and you could go and look at review the sermons, the services that you missed. They would have notes, sermon notes. The pastors would publish, write papers or little pieces blogs on different things. Well, come to find out, if they said anything that caused a discriminatory effect on people, they could be subject to this law. And so based on that, churches don't typically like to go and sue their own city. They don't want to be odious to the people they're trying to reach, but they said this was too much of a threat. In fact, it was an existential threat to the operations of the church. So we sued in Wisconsin, and praise God, we were able to get that ordinance wiped off. But you had to roll up your sleeves, and you had to be willing to engage in the adversarial process, which I think God, again, in His providence, has put us in this country so we could have those opportunities. We don't have to take up arms. We don't have to go into the catacombs. We could go to court and have fair evidence and a neutral evaluator. And so we thank God for what He's given us on that. Well, I'd like to talk just a little bit now about defenses. If you could give me the next slide. Oh, okay. All right. There are four of them. In most sermons or speeches or lectures will have 3 points. I'm going to break that rule and have 4, but I will compromise and only talk primarily about 2 of them. And so those are things to protect your church: are bylaws, employment contracts, marriage policy, and employment. Facilities use policy. Let's go to the next slide. First are bylaws. Your church has bylaws. Some churches will have something called a constitution. which is very similar. Most states treat a constitution and a bylaw as the same, so don't worry about the nomenclature. But if you have, and some churches will have a constitution and bylaws. It's sort of a belt and suspenders approach, where the constitution is a little bit stronger, harder to change, and then a bylaws is more administrative policies. So in any event, you need to have in your bylaws, typically somewhere in your face statement or maybe just the section below it, something defining marriage. This is something I wrote, and I think this is helpful. If you'll notice that I put in there that the churches are not going to accept or consent to whatever the government says a valid marriage is. And so with these churches that I was representing, none of them would allow for same-sex marriage. Some of them had rules, doctrinal rules on divorce and remarriage or marriage with a non-believer. They had various nuances in their own theology about marriage. And so though the civil law allows for all of these types, they said, we have our own view of marriage, and and this is what it is. So I think it's important that you put this in there. And another item, and if you move to the next one, something on human sexuality. This is important. You say, why do we focus on sex so much? Aren't there other things in the Bible? Why don't you talk about gossip or lying or theft or murder? Why this? Well, the reason this is because this sex is a civil right in our society, so we have to deal with it accordingly. You don't typically have a right to commit arson. Arson would be a sin, but we don't have to deal with that. It's not a civil right, so we have to have that. If you look at this has, it's fairly thorough. I have pastors that will add things to this. And, I think I heard a sermon recently about, I think it was Genesis 6, where the sons of God took wives of the daughters of men. And so the thought was that maybe as we approach the end of all things, this sex with angels is going to be a new thing or something. Or you might have, or there have been things about, frankly, and I'm sorry to talk about this, but sex involving robotics and those sorts of things. But bottom line is you can make this list, it could just never ends, right? Because of the nature of man and woman for that matter. So I've also have an alternative language. If you go to the next slide, I've gone to if I were an artist, I would perhaps be a minimalist. And so I just said, instead of making a long, naughty list and keep adding and adding, just have a very straightforward. But you could use either of those, and those will work. Let's go to the next slide. It's important that you have all of your board members, your pastors, all employees, I would even say most of the volunteers, agree with your statement of faith, both by what they say and what they do. And that's really important that they do that. That is a precondition and a continual condition for those positions. Now, you say, why do we do all this? Why do we put these in the bylaws? Why do we make these rules and get into this? The reason is the courts have said that there are certain things that they won't look at. Have you heard of the concept of separation of church and state? There were a lot of Christian conservatives, attorneys out there saying, oh, that's so terrible, we don't believe in separation of church and state. Well, I do, and for a good reason. We don't want a group of 12 people from the community in a jury box determining whether or not your theology is reasonable or not. We don't want that. We don't want these in our courts. And so the courts have said, we agree with that. And so what we want to do is if something involves a church and it involves doctrine or theology, it involves ecclesiastical matters, polity, In other words, choosing ministers, what you believe, how you operate your church, your structure, how you conduct worship, those sorts of things. Court said if that is at issue, we're not going to, it's non-justiciable. We're not going to look at that. That's an affirmative defense, and so we're going to kick those cases out of court. So that's why we put these kinds of things in bylaws, so that you've got those, got a defense. So if you get sued, and that may well happen, is you show the court as Exhibit A. These are our bylaws, and they'll see that and they go, well, this is a internal church dispute, and courts don't want to deal with that. So they'll kick the case out. Next slide. Employment contract. So for employment contracts, a lot of people say, you know, I live in most of you from California, from other states, a lot of states have what they call at-will employment. You could fire someone for any or no reason, right? The problem is that that's not entirely true. So, for example, if you were at Taco Bell and you can't fire the cook because you said, well, I found out he was Jewish, so I fired him. You can't fire, there's certain reasons you really can't fire people for. And so you want to put in things in your contract, have an employment contract, again, to have a specific defense. Now, what I put in employment contracts for churches is they have to agree, they have to be a member of the church if you're going to be an employee, and you're going to be subject to church discipline. So if you fail in something that is core to the church, in both conduct and faith, that's a breach of contract, and you could be let go. Let me give you an example. There are people and there are court cases like this, where someone they just don't agree with the church on, say, sexual ethics. They don't agree. They may have, I'm seeing typically they'll have a gay or lesbian child, and so they just don't buy into what the church says about it. They themselves are not engaged in improper conduct, but they will put something on social media, on Facebook, that is inconsistent with what the church believes. And so most churches don't want employees that don't buy into the doctrine of the church. It's just not a good fit. And so that's why it's important to do that. One exception, you don't need a contract, believe it or not, for your pastors, or anyone who's what we would deem our clergy. And the reason is the courts, goes back to the separation of church and state. The courts have said since the 1870s, all the way up to, they had a case like two or 3 years ago in the Supreme Court that affirmed this, that choosing who's going to lead a church is so intimately part of the spiritual life of the church that courts cannot, under the Constitution, get involved in that business. So a church can remove a pastor for any reason, and the courts will not look at it. So you don't need this is counterintuitive. This is usually the most senior person on the church staff. That's the one person you actually don't need a contract for. But those underneath, you would. So are you tracking with me? Okay, good. All right. Now, you may say, I don't have the bandwidth, the knowledge to be able to write a contract. So, nice attorney that I am, I've got one that I'm going to provide to you. And what it is, I've got a employment contract. You have one of these. If you don't have one, I don't know where they're at. They're in the back. Make certain you get one of these and fill it out. And I have a document for you. It's about 14 pages. What this document has, it has a sample employment contract. I will send it to you in have the staff send it to you in Microsoft Word so you could edit it and put in names in your church and the salary or whatever you're going to put in there. I also have a application for use of your facilities. You should have, one of the problems that was happening in this case in Wisconsin is you need to have some policy that the church has for use of your facilities. Because when you start renting out your facilities, you have two problems. One is you may have tax liability because it could be deemed business income. Another thing, you could have property tax liability. Another thing is you might end up unknowingly going into the same laws as Taco Bell, where you have the business statutes, because you're engaged in commerce, right? So you need to have a policy in place, and an application and a contract. That's what I've got for you, is a church policy, sample church policy, a sample application, and a sample contract. Another thing I have for you, if you'll send me your email and just ask for it. Actually, we'll do it, make it easy. If you just fill one of these out and I get it from here, I'll know to send you these items. The other item is a marriage policy and bylaws, sample bylaw language for you.